The evening sun spread its dull golden light over the dry land, painting everything in shades of brown and red. Tom Harris stood at the edge of his ranch, staring across the wide fields that once were green with grass and life. Now they were cracked and dusty. The drought had lasted far too long. His cattle were thin, the water wells were almost empty, and hope seemed to fade with each setting sun. Tom was not a lazy man. He had worked on this land since he was a boy. His father and grandfather had built this ranch from nothing, and Tom had grown up dreaming of keeping their legacy alive. But hard work wasn't enough anymore. The rains had stopped coming and the land was dying. Every morning, Tom woke before sunrise trying to fix fences, carry water, and feed the few animals left. But every night he sat on his porch and watched the stars, wondering how much longer he could fight against something he couldn't control. He hadn't told anyone, but the bank had already warned him. If he missed one more payment, they would take everything. He had sold half his cattle already, and the rest were barely worth anything. His savings were gone. There were days when he skipped meals just to make sure the animals had something to eat. He had become quiet, spending his days in the fields and his nights thinking about the past. One Saturday morning, Tom decided to go to the small town nearby. He loaded what little hay he had left into his old truck and drove down the dusty road. His plan was to sell the hay and buy enough feed for the week. He told himself it was just another trip, but deep down he felt tired. Not just in his body, but in his heart. When he reached the market, it looked emptier than usual. The air smelled of dust and tiredness. People stood behind their stalls selling vegetables, eggs, or handmade crafts, but no one looked cheerful. Everyone in that town was struggling. The drought hadn't spared anyone. Farmers, shopkeepers, even the local baker, all of them had lost something. Tom parked his truck and started calling out to passers-by, trying to sell his hay. Some looked, some nodded politely, but no one bought anything. Hours passed and the sun climbed high in the sky. Sweat ran down Tom's back as he wiped his face with his old handkerchief. The few coins in his pocket clinked softly, not enough to buy even a full meal. As the afternoon faded, Tom packed up, disappointed once again. He was about to climb into his truck when he heard a small, trembling voice behind him. "Sir," the voice said softly. He turned around. Standing there was a little girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old. Her clothes were worn but clean. She held something tightly in her small hands, a doll with a faded dress and tangled yarn hair. The doll looked old but well-loved. Tom smiled gently. "Hello there," he said. "What's your name?" The girl hesitated, clutching her doll. "My name's Lucy," she whispered. Her eyes were big, but they carried a kind of sadness that no child should have. Tom knelt down a little so he could see her face clearly. "Hi, Lucy, what brings you here?" She swallowed hard and said, almost in a whisper, Would you buy my doll?" Tom blinked. "Your doll?" he asked softly. "Why would you want to sell your doll, sweetheart?" Her eyes filled with tears, but she tried to be brave. "My brother hasn't eaten in 3 days," she said. "Mama is sick and we don't have any food left. I thought maybe, if I sell her, I can buy something for him." For a moment, Tom couldn't move. His heart felt like it had stopped beating. The world around him, the sound of people, the creak of wagons, the rustle of the wind, all faded away. He just stood there staring at that little girl with her doll. He looked at her hands, small and trembling, and at her doll, which was clearly something she loved very much. It wasn't just a toy. It was probably her only friend, her comfort in the nights when she went to bed hungry. Tom wanted to say something, anything, but the words got stuck in his throat. He felt helpless. He was barely surviving himself. He had only a few coins left, enough to buy his dinner and maybe some fuel for the truck. He took a deep breath and looked down at the coins in his rough, calloused hand. They weren't much, but suddenly they felt heavy, like they were burning his skin. Lucy waited quietly, her eyes full of hope. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She just stood there, brave and patient, holding out her doll. Finally, Tom spoke, his voice trembling. "How much do you want for her?" Lucy looked at the doll, then at him. "Just enough for some bread," she whispered. Tom reached into his pocket and pulled out the coins. It wasn't much, but it was all he had left. He placed them gently into her hand. "I'll take your doll," he said softly. For the first time, Lucy smiled. It was a small, shy smile, but it lit up her whole face. "Thank you, sir," she said. Her voice was still soft, but it carried so much gratitude that Tom felt his eyes sting. She carefully handed him the doll, holding it for one last second before letting go. Then she ran off down the road, her bare feet kicking up dust. Tom stood there staring after her until she disappeared into the distance. Then he looked down at the doll in his hand. The sunlight caught on the doll's faded buttons, and he thought about how tightly Lucy had held it. He climbed into his truck, placed the doll on the seat beside him, and sat there for a long time. He didn't start the engine. He just sat staring at the empty street, thinking about that little girl and her brother. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten all day, but he didn't care anymore. The coins he'd given her were supposed to buy him a small meal. Now they would buy bread for 2 hungry children instead. As he finally started the truck and began driving home, the evening sky turned orange and pink. The doll sat beside him, silent and still, but Tom felt like it was watching him. For some reason, he couldn't look away from it. That night, he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lucy's face, her trembling lips, her hopeful eyes, and that small smile when he handed her the coins. He thought about her brother, about the hunger in that house, and about how a little girl had been willing to give up her only doll just to feed him. He turned on the lamp beside his bed and looked at the doll again. It sat on the table, its painted smile faint but kind. Something inside Tom's heart shifted. He felt a strange ache, not just pity, but a deep realization. All his life he had worked hard, trying to survive, trying to protect what was his. But now, for the first time, he understood what true struggle looked like. He whispered into the quiet room, "I should have done more." The wind blew softly outside, rattling the old window panes. The moonlight fell across the small doll, and it seemed almost alive in the pale light. Tom leaned back on his pillow, his eyes heavy but his mind wide awake. He didn't know why that little girl had come to him or why her words had struck him so deeply. But he knew he couldn't forget her. The next morning, as the first light of dawn crept across the sky, Tom sat up and stared at the doll again. Something inside him told him that this wasn't the end of the story, that somehow, that little girl had entered his life for a reason. He didn't know what he was going to do yet, but one thing was certain. He couldn't just stay silent anymore outside. The sky was clear, and a soft breeze moved through the fields. It was still dry, the earth still cracked. But for the first time in a long while, Tom felt a small spark of purpose inside him. He picked up the doll, brushed the dust off its dress, and placed it carefully on the dashboard of his truck. Then he whispered, "All right, little one. Let's see where this takes us." The engine started with a rumble, and the truck rolled down the dirt road. The doll sat beside him, quiet and still. But in Tom's heart, something new had begun to grow. He didn't know it yet, but that one small act of kindness, that one choice to buy a little girl's doll, would soon change everything in his life. The next morning, the sun rose quietly over the dry fields. Tom Harris sat on the edge of his bed, still thinking about the little girl from the day before. He hadn't slept much. The image of Lucy's eyes, brave, sad, and full of hope, stayed with him all night. The doll sat on his bedside table, looking almost alive in the soft light. Tom rubbed his tired eyes and sighed. He couldn't shake the thought of that child and her brother. He kept wondering where they lived, if they had eaten, and whether the few coins he gave her had been enough to buy food. The feeling in his heart wasn't just worry. It was something deeper, something that pushed him to act. Before he could change his mind, Tom got dressed, grabbed his hat, and headed out. The morning was cool and the sound of birds filled the air. He climbed into his old truck where the doll still sat on the dashboard. He looked at it for a long moment, then said softly, "Let's go find her." He drove into town again, his tires crunching over the gravel road. The small market was open, but Lucy wasn't there. He asked a few shopkeepers if they had seen a little girl selling a doll the day before, but no one knew much. Most people just shook their heads, saying they'd noticed more hungry families lately. Finally, at the corner near the old bakery, Tom met an elderly woman sitting on a wooden bench. She looked at him kindly when he asked about the girl. After thinking for a moment, she nodded slowly and said, "There's a widow who lives near the edge of town. She's got 2 children, a boy and a girl. Poor things barely have anything to eat. Maybe that's who you're looking for." Tom thanked her and drove toward the direction she pointed. The road became rough and narrow, leading through dry grass and broken fences. At last he saw a small wooden cabin standing alone near a few dying trees. The roof was patched with old metal sheets and smoke rose weakly from the chimney. He parked his truck and stepped out, the doll still in his hand. For a moment he hesitated. He didn't know what to say or how they would react to a stranger knocking on their door. But his heart told him this was the right thing to do. He walked up the short path and knocked gently. After a few seconds, the door opened. A woman stood there, thin, tired, and pale, with eyes that looked both wary and kind. Behind her stood Lucy, holding her brother's hand. The boy looked no older than 5. His cheeks were hollow, but his eyes were bright and curious. Tom took off his hat respectfully. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "my name's Tom Harris. I met your daughter yesterday at the market." The woman's eyes widened slightly. She looked down at Lucy, who nodded shyly. "You're the man who bought her doll," she said softly. Tom nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I just wanted to see how you're all doing." For a moment, the woman didn't speak. Then she stepped aside and said, "Please come in." The inside of the cabin was small but neat. There was a table, 2 chairs, and a small stove in the corner. A few old blankets were folded neatly near the bed. The place looked worn, but it was clear the woman worked hard to keep it clean. "I didn't mean to intrude," Tom said gently. "I just wanted to bring you something." He went back to his truck and returned carrying a small bag of food, bread, milk, and a few eggs from his own kitchen. The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, sir, that's too kind," she whispered. "You didn't have to." Tom shook his head. "Please," he said softly. "It's not much, but it's something." Lucy smiled as she helped her mother unpack the food. Her brother reached for the bread eagerly, and Tom felt a lump rise in his throat when he saw how hungry the child was. They all sat together while the woman cooked a small meal. The warm smell of bread filled the little cabin. Tom stayed quiet, just watching them eat, feeling more peace in that moment than he had felt in months. After they finished, Tom helped fix a loose hinge on the door and stacked some firewood near the wall. The woman tried to thank him again, but he only smiled and said, "It's what neighbors should do." Before he left, Lucy walked up to him holding the doll he had bought. She held it out toward him. "You should keep it," Tom said, surprised. "It's yours." Lucy shook her head slowly. "You helped us when nobody else did," she said softly. "I want you to keep her. Maybe she'll remind you that you made someone happy." Tom took the doll carefully, his eyes warm. "I'll take good care of her," he promised. As he drove away that afternoon, the sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky with colors of gold and orange. The doll sat once again on his truck's dashboard, and for the first time in a long time, Tom felt something close to peace. In the days that followed, Tom couldn't stop thinking about that family. He visited them again, this time bringing some old tools and helping the boy build a small wooden toy horse. Lucy and her mother began visiting his ranch too, bringing small things like fresh-baked bread whenever they could. Word about Tom's kindness began to spread through town. Other ranchers, inspired by what he did, started helping too. One man repaired a neighbor's barn roof. Another shared water from his well. People who had once kept to themselves began reaching out to one another again. The little town slowly began to change. It wasn't rich and the drought still hurt everyone. But the spirit of kindness started to grow stronger than the hardship. One day, a local newspaper reporter came to town, hearing stories about how people were helping each other. He visited Tom's ranch and listened as Tom told him about Lucy and her doll. The reporter was deeply moved and wrote an article about the rancher who spent his last coins to help a hungry child. Weeks later, something unexpected happened. A distant cousin of Tom's, who had moved to another state years ago, read the article. He reached out to Tom saying he wanted to help. That cousin had become a successful businessman and offered to invest in Tom's ranch. With that help, Tom repaired his barns, bought new cattle, and even started hiring a few local workers who had lost their jobs. The ranch slowly came back to life. The dry land began to heal with the next season's rain, and green grass once again covered the fields. But Tom never forgot what had started it all: a small girl's courage and a worn-out doll. Years passed and Lucy grew into a bright young woman. Her brother grew strong and healthy. They often visited Tom's ranch, helping him with chores or sharing meals on the porch. They called him Uncle Tom, and he treated them like his own family. The doll stayed on a wooden shelf in Tom's living room. Whenever visitors came, they would ask about it. Tom would smile and say, "That doll saved me once." People would laugh, thinking he was joking, but he meant every word. Because that one moment, that choice to buy a doll from a hungry little girl, had changed the course of his life. It had reminded him that even in the hardest times, kindness could still exist, and one small act could light up a dark world. Sometimes, when the sun set over his now green fields, Tom would sit on his porch, the doll beside him, and think about how different things might have been if he had walked away that day. He knew now that life had strange ways of teaching lessons, not through comfort, but through compassion. He looked up at the evening sky, the same one that had watched over him in his darkest days, and whispered softly, "Thank you, Lucy." The wind carried his words across the open fields, and somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of laughter echoed, the laughter of two children who once went hungry, but now had hope. Tom smiled, his heart full. The land had life again. The town had warmth again. And he had found something far greater than wealth, the joy of giving. And every time he saw that little doll, with her faded dress and worn-out smile, he was reminded that sometimes, even the smallest hands can change the biggest hearts.